A great example of how ruthless these capitalists could be in the Gilded Age, which is known for ruthless business competition, very much so. Andrew Carnegie gives us a classic lesson. This is my favorite ruthless story, though there are many of them in this period. When Carnegie Steel was a powerful force in the industry, but still had some decent competition. I forget the name of the other company. It might have been Bethlehem Steel. I forget. But one of the competitors, Carnegie learned, had come up with a new process for producing steel that cut out some of the steps in production of steel. And Carnegie realized immediately that meant like doom. Who cares? They cut out a couple of steps, big deal. Yeah, but cutting out a couple of steps means saving money. And we already know saving money means being able to lower your prices and then get everybody else's, customers. So Carnegie recognizes as a potentially mortal threat to his business. So he could have, tried to figure out how to, do the process himself, send in spies, to figure out what they're doing, employ it himself, or found another way to lower costs different than that. And he may have tried those things, but what he did do ended up being a brilliant stroke and worked probably better than any other thing he could have tried. And then as he wrote an article in a business journal, and this wouldn't have worked if he wasn't already a big name in the business. He was already becoming a pretty famous person, so and he was quite trusted. Carnegie, I think, of all these guys, had the most likable personality. He was the most outgoing, kind of the most jovial, the most talkative, and sort of knew how to create a public image. He was very good at, sort of creating a public image and a positive one. Much more modern in that sense than the other guys here, who weren't necessarily good at that kind of thing. But on the other side of that, Carnegie was in some ways less trustworthy than the others, because everything was kind of a facade. A lot of it was a lie. He lied about a lot of things. So, the strange thing happens way too often, in history and even today. But the public, of all the guys we're looking at, I got Frick on the screen right now. Yes, I know. But among those that we're looking at, the most famous Gilded Age, captains of industry, the most well-liked by the public was Andrew Carnegie. And it might be true to say that he was like the least likable of all of them. But the public liked him because he was good at sort of smiling for the cameras and saying the right things. I mean, they didn't have, of course, movie cameras or video cameras in those days, but you see what I'm saying. So what did Carnegie do? He writes an article. How does that sort of combat this rival company putting into practice a new process of producing steel that cuts out steps? Well, he wrote that I've had my engineers, scientists study the new system that they're using, and it's clear that it's going to produce inferior quality steel that could lead to, and he left this kind of phrase dangling out there without defining it intentionally, most likely, that this kind of steel will be so inferior that it could lead to rail failure, which made it sound ominous, and that's what he wanted it to sound. That's how he wanted it to sound. It made it sound like, rail failure. So the steel is so weak, produced by this new process, that say a train, going across a trestle, a bridge that's made out of steel, it might just, at some point cause the steel in the bridge to buckle and send the train with 150 passengers aboard, sort of down to the bottom of the canyon, smashed to smithereens and all dying. That's what he's getting at. Well, what's the problem with that? It was a blatant lie. I just told you this guy had no problem lying. I should go back to Carnegie because I hate having the wrong name that I picture there. It was a bald-faced lie. In fact, he knew nothing about the process of, the new production process. And he didn't have guys study it because he couldn't get them in there. They didn't know either. So he made all that up, and he knew, or knew that it was likely that once this thing went public, and if it took off, story kind of had legs, that it would probably ruin the other company, because Carnegie was trusted, not just in steel, but kind of the larger public trusted him. So he used his good name to lie. And the other company basically knew immediately that they were checkmated. They kind of thought they had him in check, and he just totally reversed it in like one move and didn't just get out of check, but sort of established checkmate. You're done. Why? Because he was a trusted name, and if people, as they did, believed Carnegie, they're going to be now suspicious of the new company's production process that was designed to outcompete Carnegie, and now he's turned the tables on them. And he sent out an associate to make them an offer. We'll buy you out, whole company, for so much. And they declined. Came back, I don't know, like a week later, and made another offer, this time a lower offer. And this time they took it, and they bought them out. And the owners of that steel company, I'm sure retired, wealthy men, but they knew they'd been had. They knew that he'd pulled one over on them, or at least got over on them, I should say. And we know he was lying about this rail failure thing. Why? Because, and you've probably already guessed. I'll pause for a second. Think about it. That's right. You got it. Once he took over that company's steel mills, he used that production process himself, like immediately, because he knew that once he figured it out, that it's effective, it worked, didn't cause rail failure, and it would allow him to sort of lower his production costs. So just the fact that he didn't even really work to explain it. Wait a minute, you just lied and said this was going to cause rail failure, and then you just started doing it yourself once you took over the company. Yeah, okay, I lied. I mean, he didn't say it that way, but it came across like that. So this is the type of behavior that these guys, were capable of, and you see, involved in time and time again. Now, remember, they had lots of smarts. They had lots of driving ambition. They were unafraid to take chances. So they had qualities that weren't about lying and cheating as well. I'm not excusing the lying and cheating, but there are a lot of things that sort of go into this. This guy was an organizational genius. Jay Gould was kind of a wizard at financial numbers and understanding markets, this kind of thing. So they had plenty of ability. But you combine ability with ruthlessness, you've got a formidable competitor. The gospel of wealth. To add yet another element of complexity to the story of Andrew Carnegie, and whether or not we should see him as a robber baron, right, the more negative way of looking at these guys, or what's sometimes called an industrial statesman or captain of industry. Both of them are noble sounding titles. He wrote an essay in 1889, sometimes labeled or titled The Gospel of Wealth, sometimes just called Wealth. And in that, he talked about that it would be a desirable outcome if the government taxed the wealthy more, and that the wealthy should pay more taxes. But if they don't, on their own, and don't volunteer, that the government should just do it anyway. And he talked about you can see it near the top there, the beginning of the quote, or the beginning of the quote, by taxing estates heavily at death, the state marks its condemnation of the selfish millionaire's unworthy life. Wow. He's talking about himself. He's a millionaire, certainly selfish in many ways. And many of my students say, well, he was just saying that to make himself look kind of humble. But he wasn't. Trust me. Read more about him. If you read just his full essay, it's pretty clear that he was sincere. He went into sort of detail about how this should be done, why it should be done, etc. The Gospel of Wealth certainly defended the making of huge fortunes by capitalists like himself. It defended that and said they mostly do so because they have good habits and good values and morals, which isn't entirely true, but they certainly had some good habits, like hard work and saving and showing up on time and this kind of thing. But he also talks about the importance for the wealthy to give back. Not just through taxation, he believed in that too. The government should get that part, but they should do it on their own as well. Charitable giving, or what's called philanthropic giving. And he and Rockefeller both pioneered philanthropy. Not that they were the first rich people that ever gave money to charity, but they established foundations. The Carnegie and the Rockefeller foundations, both of them founded around 1911, 1913, right around the same time. And this was sort of an organized way to give your money to good causes. These guys were not about to just give money for because somebody asked for it. So they're not the type of person that when that person comes up to you on the street and says, "Hey, do you have my car broke down or I'm out of gas? Can you they wouldn't reach into their pockets and give you anything. They just sort of probably scowl at you and walk on by. But for what they considered worthy causes, they were more than willing to give and believed it was actually necessary and a duty of theirs to do so. John D. Rockefeller appears to have believed that God put him on the earth to be good at making money so that he could help other people through philanthropic giving, which says something about his own sense of self-importance, among other things. So both guys, I'll skip the Rockefeller philanthropic parts, talking about both at the same time when we get there, but both guys ended up giving the majority of their fortunes away to these philanthropic causes. But most of it went through their foundations. What's a foundation? It sounds really, really strange, and I'm simplifying, but it's kind of like you've set up a corporation and you pay one of your most trusted executives to run the foundation. You pay him a high salary to do so, and what's his job? To give your money away. What? You're gonna pay me a lot of money? An executive's CEO type salary for me to give your money away to? That's right. Because I don't want it to go to bad causes. I want to make sure it's done in an organized, efficient, effective way. So we can sort of make the most out of this. So this is what the Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations more or less did. And this was kind of a gift that kept on giving because they didn't just put money into like a one-time, big chunk of money. They gave stock permanently. So whatever, how many thousands shares it was to the foundation, that means that as long as the company existed and it was still producing a dividend in its stocks, then stock, essentially money, the share money would keep coming in. And so these foundations then were set up to be able to last a long time. Carnegie's known for founding libraries. I still see Carnegie libraries on the West Coast in California that he paid for. Andrew Carnegie was self-educated, didn't go to college, and in middle age taught himself. He knew how to read, but he started reading the classics and traveling to Europe and reading history, and he got super interested in reading and just educating himself. So he became a pretty learned person and saw the value then of education, knew the value of education, partly because he didn't have a formal one, and so not surprising he gave to start libraries and other such causes. The Rockefeller Foundation had a medical part of it. Millions of dollars went into medical research, and I don't remember the specifics, but I'm sure it did a certain amount of good for anyone that had got better medical treatment or better medicine because of the research done with Rockefeller money. One can certainly criticize these guys for all this, or for not doing this for the right reasons, because they could have been doing it for publicity reasons, to make themselves look better, make their company look better. Corporations do that all the time. There was no tax write-off in those days, so that wasn't a factor then. It is for companies now, unless they could be still doing this for completely selfish motives. But I don't think so. The selfish motives are probably in there. It's probably part of it. But the PR, make yourself look good, I'm sure that's there. But it appears to me that they were serious about this. And even if they did it for the wrong reasons, do you think someone that, let's say, whose life was saved from a medical treatment or a medicine that was produced, invented, with Rockefeller money through his foundation, would care if they knew that Rockefeller was the guy that, first of all, put the money behind this medication, and secondly, that he did it not because he cared about me or anybody that would take the medication, but it made him look good with the public. You wouldn't care. I wouldn't. If it saved my life and I knew he was going to put up the money, I'd applaud him. So the motives, for people doing good things, they can matter. I'm not saying they never matter, but sometimes I don't think they matter. And in this case, a lot of good was done, whatever the motivation for Rockefeller and Carnegie was. Lastly, on this, I think it's interesting to note that Carnegie and Rockefeller are the two richest guys in the Gilded Age. Rockefeller first, Carnegie second. And they're the ones who gave the most to charity, partly because they had the most to give away. But they gave away the majority of their fortunes. I don't know if anybody else gave away the majority of their fortune. And they were the two guys that started sort of yelling loudest about the duty, as they saw it, of millionaires, billionaires to give back to society. Why would it be the two richest guys that said that? And I don't know this for sure, but I have a suspicion that, at least in part, it's because they'd been so successful already. They'd already conquered every obstacle and sort of achieved everything they possibly could in business. What else do they have to prove there? It's sort of like been there, done that. Let's move on to something more interesting now. It's kind of boring, too easy. So I think they sort of sought other things in life and maybe started to see, okay, I've got the money. That's not going to ever be a worry again. But I still don't feel totally satisfied. What else could I do to make myself feel whole? Some new challenge. And some of that, I think, is probably behind their efforts to try to sort of help to improve the world, with the throwing around of their money. Creative destroyer number 3, John D. Rockefeller, quite possibly the richest American of all time. His fortune maxed out at like 1.6 billion, but adjusted for inflation, that would be in the tens of billions today. And he often gets ranked when business magazines will try to figure out who the richest American is. He's usually ranked number 1. I have that here. CNN Money, American Heritage, Business Insider did these separate studies of the richest Americans ever. And all 3 of them concluded that John D. Rockefeller was the richest one ever. These were all before, like, Jeff Bezos and some of the others, so it might be different now. But if you look on here, Bill Gates is number 12. Now, this could be wrong because it's not easy to compare fortunes across decades and centuries. So that's why you see each list is somewhat different. There's sort of room to disagree about this. On one list, and the one on the right, Bill Gates is 4. So he's 4, 5, and 12. Right? Sam Walton, Walmart guy. Sam Walton is 12 on the right one, 11 in the middle, and is he even on the other one? He's not even on the other one. And yet, Rockefeller is number 1 on all 3 lists. So that gives you a sense. Whether he's number 1 in reality or not, we'll probably never know. But I think there's no disputing that Rockefeller is one of the richest Americans ever. So he's playing, sort of in the big leagues. He's at the very top. That's to be sure. Rockefeller had an interesting personality. He was quite taciturn. One person that knew him said, No matter what the excitement, John retained his quietude and smiled on all occasions. Mark Hanna, who we'll meet again in a number of capacities, famous guy in his own right, powerful guy, but he knew it. Rockefeller said, he's sane in every respect save one. He's money mad. So he believed that Rockefeller was a normal guy, except for the fact that he just was crazy about money. One biographer has noted that he prowled the floor of the refinery and constantly searched for waste and carelessness. That's another way of talking about what we already dealt with Andrew Carnegie, and this is a guy who sees the importance of saving money at the production end, finding ways to cut back waste so we don't spend as much money, waste as much money here, and so then we can afford to sell our product more cheaply and undersell our opponents at the other end. But Rockefeller was known for not saying much, and he was certainly a bright guy, also with, I think, a genius for organization. But his sort of quiet actually intimidated people. Whether he did it on purpose or not to intimidate people is not entirely clear. It does seem to have been part of his personality, but he might have realized at some point, I'm a naturally quiet guy, but it also helps. People are scared of me. I think a lot of people get this wrong, the psychology of this wrong. We tend to think in this day and age that the more you sort of talk, the more confidently you talk, and the more you talk confidently, the more you intimidate people. I don't find that to be true at all. I think it's people that are quietly confident, quietly confident that are intimidators. I think that's what really scares people. If there's people sitting around a table, a dinner party or something, and some people don't know each other at the table, and there's one person that you don't know there that's totally quiet, just listening, and while you're talking, listening, but never says a word, you're likely to focus on that person and think, what are they thinking? Are they judging me? What they got a funny look on their face. Why do they have a smirk on their face? You're likely to notice and in a sense kind of resent the person that's quiet. It kind of gives them a certain power. So being quiet can actually be powerful, and whether he did this deliberately or not, it worked. And I suspect he did do it deliberately, because it's sort of noted again and again, comes up again and again in his career. So how big was Standard Oil? Well, you can see this headquarters in Manhattan. But when the government finally broke up Standard Oil through antitrust proceedings in I think 1913, somewhere in there, Rockefeller was still alive, but in retirement at that point, they split up his company. Standard Oil was so giant, it was seen to be a monopoly in restraint of trade against the law. But it was broken up in a number of sort of fragmented companies. And look at the companies that it broken up into: BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, all these big name companies that. So it's like every gas station you drive by. Oh yeah, that company was originally owned by John D. Rockefeller. And so was that one. That one too. So in a sense, he was the oil industry until he got broken up. And he retained shares in all these companies as well, these splinter corporations. And it actually made him richer after his company got broken up than before. The share prices went up, so his fortune increased. So the government broke up his company, and I'm sure he wasn't happy about it. He actually probably wasn't happy about it, but it made him actually more money. Standard Oil had a spectacular rise, founded in 1870, just into the Gilded Age. 20 years later, Rockefeller's company was doing 90% of the oil refining in the U.S. Oil refineries looked like that. And that's an incredible rise. And at 90% of the oil refining, that's by legal definition or by economist definition, a monopoly. Nobody achieves 100%. Unless you live in a country that, it's the country that controls the oil industry or something, which happens. but a capitalist company never gets 100%. So that's a monopoly. He achieved at least a horizontal monopoly that we'll get to. Rockefeller himself came from fairly humble beginnings. His dad was a farmer in New York State, not a rich one. They weren't dirt poor, but they were, not certainly modest means they lived by. But he had an interesting upbringing and parental background. His dad, though a farmer, was kind of this wheeler-dealer guy, schmoozer, and was trying to always sort of get rich quick schemes. He used to play games with his little kids, John and his brother, when they were kids, and play them games, and he would cheat, like at cards or whatever. And what he claimed was probably true. He claimed, I'm trying to make them sharp. I'm trying to teach my kids that there's going to be people out there that try to rip you off in life, and you need to be able to spot it. So I'm cheating you in these little games we're playing to teach you a lesson, so in later life you can see how not to be cheated. Whether he was doing that way on purpose or not, it probably had that effect on John Jr. here, or John Rockefeller. Dad wasn't John. At one point, his dad was selling these quack-like herbal medicines in other towns, and he'd be gone from the family home without telling anyone for like a week or so. His wife had no idea where he was. He'd just take off. I don't know if he ever even explained it. And we now know that he was in these nearby towns, usually under an assumed name. He had these number of aliases. He called himself Doctor, what the last name was, and he's selling these herbal, totally phony medicines to people. And I don't know how much money he made. It certainly wasn't a lot, but he might have made some doing it. But he had a charming personality. His dad, he was kind of big, tall, handsome guy, so the ladies liked him. He was one of those guys that could talk sports and the macho stuff. So the guys wanted to be buddy with him, and he used his charm and his good looks then to help him to sell, rip people off, selling products that were worthless. Rockefeller's mother was this pious Christian, a serious Baptist churchgoer, and she instilled in both of her sons the value of hard work, discipline, right, putting off play until after you'd finished your work, being on time, being honest, being punctual, etc. And Rockefeller seems to have inherited or learned those qualities as well. So from his dad, he got this sort of wild and conniving, risk-taking, swashbuckling sort of style of doing business, and from his mom he got the opposite, which is sort of do things the right way, put in an honest, hard day's work. You combine those two together, which is what I think you get in John D. Rockefeller, and you have a formidable business person there, someone you probably don't want to be on the wrong side of, however much he's quiet and kind of softly smiles at you. Standard Oil did use horizontal integration, and again, he did the vertical that we saw Carnegie doing as well, and vice versa, but our text again uses him as with. So a horizontal monopoly or horizontal integration means that you control, right, that one phase of the industry, as much as you can. 90% refining is a monopoly. There were still 10% of competitors out there. So like oil wells, right? If you started buying oil wells, which you did, pipelines, which you did, right? That's trying to create a vertical monopoly. So again, like Carnegie, he's trying to do both, but he was more successful in the horizontal monopoly, getting rid of all the other oil refiners. He thought that competition was actually wasteful. And so I was trying to kind of get away from competition, which is somewhat ironic because if you think about it, rugged competition to drive your competitors out of business is designed to end the competition. So you don't have any competition. You're trying to wipe them all out. So you control the market yourself. That's what a monopoly is. I mean, a totally successful one. So it's ironic because these guys were excellent competitors whose ultimate goal was not to have to be competitors. So this is what's going on. And competition is wasteful. It's kind of a way to remember that, his own statement. So how did he drive people out of business in oil refining? Part of it was being able to price his oil more cheaply and then get into price wars with other oil companies and lower the price. But he would do it on purpose. He didn't invent this as an idea, but most of the time, actually, it was other oil companies that would start lowering their prices first and get into these price wars with each other. He started some of them, but either way, it didn't matter. You weren't going to beat Standard Oil, especially once it became the number one oil company. It had too many advantages. So whether he started it or not, his company, Standard, started it or not, they'd start to just keep lowering their price sort of day after day, week after week. And they'd get to a point sometimes where Rockefeller's company itself was losing money. They've cut their prices so much that we're not making money. But they were willing to take short-term losses because they knew that the other competitor companies, or some of them anyway, wouldn't be able to hold out if they kept going lower because they're now losing so much money that they're out of business. They're bankrupt. Rockefeller wasn't bankrupt. He could afford the losses in the short term and was willing to take them because it's worth it. If the two companies sort of next to you are collapse, go bankrupt. You've either driven out of business, so you don't have a competitor any longer there, or you buy them out. He would do one or the other and make them an offer saying, you know what, I could ruin you. It's going that direction, but I'll offer you, $10 million for your business. Yeah, but it's worth 18. Like I said, I'll offer you 10 million. And he actually tended to make fair offers the first time. Actually more than fair, kind of higher than market price for companies that he was driving to the wall through price wars and then trying to buy out. But if you said no the first time, the second offer wouldn't be nearly as generous. And by that time, the company would be, desperate to make a deal. But he was generous usually the first time. He's actually, I think, a much more honest business person than Andrew Carnegie. Though the symmetry is perfect here. I told you that Carnegie was the much more well-liked person by the public. Not only was that not true of Rockefeller, in time, John D. Rockefeller became, in the media and in the public eye, partly because of the media, sort of the symbol of the heartless, ruthless, greedy, mean-spirited capitalist. He was sort of seen as this evil mastermind behind capitalism and ruining everybody else in the country in the process. And Carnegie was seen as a good guy by the public. So it's not the first or the last time the public has gotten things, mighty wrong. Not just about people, but about issues. So it happens. But it is interesting. Rockefeller was, the nicer guy, and Carnegie was the golden boy, and Rockefeller was the villain. One of the ways that Rockefeller was able to get in these bidding wars and succeed, besides the fact that he was, once he became the number one oil refiner, he just had so much money, and so much credit that he could, keep going with these price reductions, these price wars. But he got railroad rebates as well. These other things too, but this is the famous one. What does that mean? Rockefeller, when I say Rockefeller, I mean his, company. He's the number one guy, but he's sometimes sending out, other agents and executives to carry out some of these deals. He's the big guy. But Rockefeller would go to railroads and say, hey, look, you know who we are? We're Standard Oil. We do 90% of the refining of oil, which means we do 90% of the the oil traffic on the railway lines. We got to get our oil to market. The railways are the way to do it. And so you want our business because it's going to be a giant volume of business since we do 90% of the oil. And the railroad company would be like, well, okay. But Standard Oil would say, if we're going to give you that much business, you're going to have to give us better rates than our competitors, mean charge us less to ship our oil on your railroad than what our competitors are charged, and they'd always go for it because it was in the best interest of both. But of course, it screwed the other companies because they couldn't do this. So they're paying more to railroads to ship their oil. Rockefeller, who can afford to pay way more, is paying less to ship his oil because he's seen how to take this. It's a good example of something that good capitalists do. Not necessarily nice, but it's effective. And that is they see advantage, an advantage they have, and see a way, find a way, figure out a way to turn that advantage into another advantage, and then another one. So the fact that he already had sort of more money and was the biggest company, I can now turn that to even bigger advantage. Everyone's going to know, every railroad company is going to want our business, so I can drive a hard bargain and to force them to lower their prices if they want our business. So this guy wasn't just sitting still. He was constantly innovating to cut costs, right? To transportation costs or costs. This is a way to save money, to be able to undersell their opponents and competitors at the other end. Standard Oil and Rockefeller also pioneered the trust and the use of holding companies, where corporate structures started to get extremely complicated, and you kind of hide things, hide finances and hide profits in this kind of elaborate shell game that goes on. And trusts, there's a number of definitions of the word trust, which is just I trust you, but there's also living trust, something. But this type of trust is a business arrangement, and again, Rockefeller didn't invent the trust, but he used it probably more skillfully and to greater advantage than anybody else in the Gilded Age. And trusts weren't illegal yet. It's partly because of Rockefeller's success with the trust that it eventually does get made illegal, and we start to see antitrust legislation, which we'll get to as well. But it's complicated. I'm going to keep this very simple. It's so simple it's not entirely accurate, but it's close enough. I wouldn't steer you the wrong way. So it's sort of like what's happening here is Standard Oil is coming to these other businesses, other competitors, and saying, "Look, we could ruin you, right? You've seen plenty of companies that have gotten into price wars with us, and we drive them all out of business. They can't compete. You can't either. So we're going to make you a deal. Here's what's going to happen. If you say yes, you're going to sign over day-to-day decision-making power to me, John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, but then we're going to keep you on as the manager of now a subsidiary of Standard Oil, which means you're no longer the owner of your own independent oil company. You're now a manager for Standard Oil. So you're not the big cheese any longer. But how would that be attractive to the other company and its leader? And this is the kicker. This was the selling point. Rockefeller would say, as a subsidiary of Standard Oil, you're going to have now all of the advantage. You're going to be one of us, so you'll get the railroad rebates and on and on. So you'll make more money than you won't have quite as much power because you have to answer to me. But you'll have more money. You'll make more money. You'll retire richer and more successful than you would if you stay independent. And this was an offer that many just thought we can't refuse. We've seen the damage this guy can do when people try to compete with him. Now he's offering us something that gives him more power, yes, and gives him even more profit, yes, but it assures that I stay, sort of in a high, important job, and have a lot of money still. So this started to work, and so more and more independent, smaller oil companies basically sold under the trust arrangement. So it's kind of a different way to drive someone out of business, and a different way it's kind of in between driving them out and buying their company. That's how to say it. It's sort of an in between buying them out or driving them into bankruptcy. This is a middle of the road strategy in that sense. Rockefeller believe it or not, didn't live as lavishly as some of the Gilded Age capitalists. But this ain't bad. Kaikut in Hudson Valley is pretty famous. It's actually astonishing to see this place. Actually, I lied. That's actually my summer home there. I'm trying to get a nicer place, but I can't afford it right now. So, no, I'm kidding. Wouldn't I be in heaven? So, yeah, this guy didn't spend a lot of time, playing and necessarily enjoying life, at least until he retired. But he still lived pretty lavishly. Standard Oil developed a great deal of political power to go along with its sort of economic clout. They say money is power, and there's some truth in this, but I don't think money is necessarily power. If wielded the right way, it certainly is power. And some people don't know how to wield it the right way and don't really acquire power. But Rockefeller certainly did. So he got Standard all kinds of sort of political benefits because of his savvy. Actually, a senator named Nelson Aldrich, mover and shaker senator at the time in the U.S. Senate, married one of Rockefeller's daughters. They started calling him the senator from Standard Oil, not the senator from Maine, or I forget where he's from. Instead of saying the state, like the senator from California, the senator from here, they started derisively calling this guy, Nelson Aldrich, the senator from Standard Oil. And sure enough, he did the bidding of Standard Oil and sort of big business, big corporate interests, which I think he was already inclined to do even before he married Rockefeller's daughter. But certainly that raises an eyebrow, does it not? So Rockefeller knew how to make politics work for him as well. Like I said, he became the symbol in the media's public eye of heartless monopoly, greed, ruthlessness, etc. Lampooned again and again and again in political cartoons like this one. And it's not that there wasn't any truth to some of this stuff. It's just, why single out him and I actually think, and I could be wrong, but I think Carnegie was the guy that would have been the better villain here. But Carnegie smiled too much and said too many nice things. This guy was quiet and didn't really care about his image that much, and he paid the price for it in the end. Keeping it in the family, the transition between family partnership and that style of business, old-fashioned business, and publicly traded corporations, the new way of doing it, which is the standard way of doing it, I shouldn't say standard, the normal way of doing it today. The photograph is John D. Rockefeller and John Rockefeller Jr., who inherited the business eventually. That's not bad, by the way. John Rockefeller Jr. Did something really, really smart. Probably the most important decision you can make in life, he made, and he made it the right way. You know what it was? He chose the right parents at birth. That's right, he chose John D. Rockefeller as his dad. That was smart, That kind of made his future for him. I made a big mistake. I chose a high school teacher and a hairdresser. And I wasn't nearly as I've not been nearly as well off as John Jr. Not a bad fortune to be bequeathed to. But John D. Rockefeller Jr. was a competent businessman. Maybe most famously, he built Rockefeller Center. Not with his bare hands, but I mean, it was his money and his project. If you've been to the top of the Rock in New York City, that's Rockefeller Center. View of the entire New York area. It's so high up there. But where NBC Studios is, it was built during the Great Depression of the 1930s. So John D. Rockefeller Jr. is maybe most famous for that. But keeping it in the family, what does this mean? Well, we're at kind of a transitional period here in American business, or world business for that matter, because it was still pretty common for family-owned firms or just individually owned firms, and still pretty common for the person who founded the company, the person who had hands-on everyday control of the company, the owner of the company, to be sort of one and the same. This isn't true any longer. There are still some private family partnership arrangements out there, sometimes big businesses like Warren Buffett's. But most of the big corporations now, and the famous ones we know, are publicly traded. And this is what they sometimes call the new way. These guys are still kind of in the old-fashioned way. They're just at the very end, transition period of the old way of doing it. But the new way is what they sometimes call the investor, the shareholder managerial split. Shareholder managerial split, which means that most of the time, if it's a publicly traded corporation, all of the time, that the person who runs the company is not the person who owns the company. But that's never true of a small business. A small business, if you own it, you're the guy there every day, making decisions and telling employees what to do. But in public traded corporations, the guy who runs the business is a manager, just a highly paid one. We call him a CEO. But he doesn't usually own the business. He might have stock options as part of his compensation package, but he doesn't own it. It's the major shareholders that own it. And they basically, in a sense, the board of directors hired him to be their professional manager. But this is still in a day where that's only just starting. And so John Rockefeller, John D., and eventually his son, Andrew Carnegie, these are giant firms of the kind that would be and eventually were publicly traded, but they maintained control of them. They still showed up every day and made the decisions. So Rockefeller and Carnegie were fantastically knowledgeable about how the steel and oil industry respectively worked, because they spent every day in the office. So they were both owner and manager at the same time. So keeping it in the family, meaning this is the old-fashioned way of doing it. But that's changing rapidly right around this period. Charitable giving, Rockefeller Foundation, we already kind of covered that. Now we get to the brakeman, John Pierpont or J.P. Morgan, and the rise of finance in America. If Rockefeller was the king of the oil industry and Carnegie the king of the steel industry, Gould one of the most important players in railroads, J.P. Morgan was easily the most influential banker, and his bank the most influential bank on Wall Street in America. He wasn't the richest of the bankers. His bank wasn't the biggest, but he had the most clout, easily. So money is power, but doesn't necessarily mean that more money is always more power. You have to know what to do with it, and this guy certainly did in terms of leveraging it for power's sake. So he acquired enormous power. Henry Adams, descendant of John Adams and John Quincy Adams, a writer, historian of the time, said humorously, Pierpont Morgan is apparently trying to swallow the sun. This guy's just so ambitious. He just seems to just sort of, everything, sort of gets pushed out of the way in his path. And he was kind of an intimidator of a guy, could be brash and loud, yelled at his servants at home, and had a bad temper. You can see his nose is rather large. Don't I know how that works? But he had this condition. Fortunately, I don't have that. I forget what it's called, but every once in a while his nose would break out with these little red, like pustule kind of things, kind of like pimples, I guess, but they'd be like all over his nose and red. And he already had a large bulbous nose, as you can see, to begin with. And he's a guy that yells at people all the time. So if you're one of his employees and he's talking to you and you're looking him in the eye, that'd be uncomfortable. I don't know if he ever did this, but can you imagine? You're this kind of, you're almost shaking in your boots. It's, oh my God, it's Morgan. He's talking to me. And you're looking at him kind of nodding and saying yes. What if he says, are you looking at my nose? No, sir. What do you mean? Why would I be looking at your nose? So that must have been difficult when this thing broke out. I forget what they call that. So, and Morgan, by the way, wasn't a rags to riches story. He was a rich kid. His father, Junius Morgan, was a successful and rich investment banker before him. And so he basically learned the trade from his dad. He vacationed in Europe. He went to college in Germany. In the 19th century, almost everybody agreed that the best universities in the world were in Germany, Americans included. That's why Morgan ended up in German university and graduated from a German university, because everyone thought they were the best. But of course, only rich people could afford to send their kids all the way to Germany or England, Oxford, to be educated. So he was a pampered rich kid, but certainly didn't just sit around and do nothing, because his bank, kind of a version of his father's, ended up being more successful and more lucrative, and earned him more power than his father. His real advantage, as one biographer has said, what distinguished Morgan was what he knew and how he employed that knowledge. He dealt in business intelligence, which he leveraged to an extent that made him arbiter of the nation's economy and occasionally the most powerful man in the country. So an interesting quote. It says he dealt in business intelligence. It doesn't mean intelligence in the like, hey, that guy's very smart kind of thing. It means intelligence like in the CIA sense, gathering intel. He dealt in sort of gathering info on people. I mean, not by spying on them per se, but by having his kind of ear to the wall, so to speak, and sort of being in key positions to, know what was going on because you're sitting at the meeting. And he had so much knowledge of the economy. Probably, we can't prove this, of course, but it's been said a lot, probably the single most knowledgeable person about the American economy in business or in government at the time. And we'll see one of the reasons why that was true, how he was able to gather so much knowledge about the economy. But then he knew how to leverage that to a fantastic extent. So again, another example of taking one advantage and being able to leverage it into and make it into an even bigger advantage or a different advantage. So he did that as well. As the brakeman, right, he's the guy that sort of after Rockefeller and Gould and Carnegie and others like them sort of crash through barriers and drag everyone along and elbow them, and everybody's bloody and bruised. Yet the economy has moved forward. All of them, ruggedly trying to compete with each other. Everybody's out of breath now and bloody and grass stains and dirt because they've been wrestling in the mud, competing with each other. But they have moved the economy forward. Morgan comes in and says, "Okay, let's clean this up. Let's slow down. Take a bit of a break. We have to smooth this out. Good job, but it's pretty messy." And one of the ways that he thought this could and should be done is to consolidate, which meant mergers and acquisition, bring smaller companies together and find ways to make deals so they merge and become one larger company, which we're very much used to now. Big corporations and sometimes industries, we only have a few, big players or players at all in them. But he believed that this was actually a way to make the economy better, not just for himself, but he actually believed that it was better for citizens, for consumers this way as well, average people. He could have been wrong about it, or he could have been right, but he appears to have honestly believed that it was better for the economy. And though he was greedy in certain ways, and certainly he loved making a fortune and was good at it, I do think, and I've read a lot about this gentleman too, I do think that he really did see himself as a guy who was responsible for the health of the economy. Since he's the guy kind of in the central position with the most knowledge, and everybody knew it, everybody believed it, he felt a responsibility essentially to keep the economy stable. So he actually made the perfect brakeman because he had the clout, he had the knowledge, and he had the sort of the goal of being sort of the guy that kept everything together. And the government damned well knew it. So partly because of Morgan, J.P. Morgan and Company at 23 Wall Street, seeing the upper right, banking became, I think, the central industry by the end of the Gilded Age. I said it was railroads before banking by around the turn of the century. Bankers exerted enormous influence through companies, stocks, and bonds. Morgan was on the board of directors of many companies. So he controlled not only banks, but insurance companies, stock market operations, owned railroads, et cetera, or was a member of the board of directors. He was on, again, dozens of boards. So was Rockefeller. This is one of the ways he leveraged his power. So let's say a business is coming in, manufacturers of cloth, a textile company, and they want to build a new factory, and they're trying to get a $25 million loan at J.P. Morgan and Company. And Morgan's probably not the guy that's going to handle it. One of his employees will. Maybe he'll come in and check in every once in a while. And let's say the deal's almost done. Credit check is worked out. They couldn't do credit checks like we can today, of course. A lot of banking still then, not all, you could do some checking, time consuming, but a lot of it came down to kind of a handshake and a look in the eye, and the banker having to sort of make an assessment. This guy looked shifty. Does he look nervous? Does he look, what can I tell about his appearance and his, his mannerisms, his what he's saying, how he's saying it, that might give me a clue as to whether I can trust this guy with my money or not. So it was in some ways old-fashioned in that sense. But they could do other things, checking your background, check like sources, references, this kind of thing, check your employment history, just not at their fingertips. But let's say the last day, they're about to sign all the papers. Executive of the borrower, is there signing documents, like when you buy a new car or a home, you sign 1 million documents, and guy comes in and says, "Okay, everything looks good. We're almost done. One last thing, you got to sign this one here. What's that? Well, this says that your company is going to take on Mr. Morgan as a permanent voting member of your board of directors." What? He's a banker. I own a textile business. Yeah, but 25 million we're loaning you is a lot of money. We want to make sure that you make sound decisions with it. So we'd like to have Mr. Morgan there as a member of the board. And when he wants to show up, he can, and he can vote, and he can participate as a full member of your board. Sometimes it was an associate of his, one of his executives that was on the board, or showed up to the meetings in lieu of, as a proxy for Morgan. But this is one of the ways that he gathered so much information and knowledge about the economy. How did he learn about these other industries? Because he sat on all of their boards. He's in their meetings. He's, in a sense, part of their company. And nobody said no to that. First of all, it's J.P. Morgan. It was an intimidating force, and you need the money. You can go to another bank, but they might try to do the same thing with you as well. So he got on dozens of boards of directors. So he had knowledge of kind of every strand of business, every industry in the country. This is one of the ways that this guy acquired so much, a vast knowledge of what the economy was doing, during this period. So he was a consolidator. He Morganized, as they started to call it, his sort of passion for and penchant talent for consolidating businesses, bringing them together into large ones. Charles Morris, who I've quoted already before, says Morgan's genius was that of the disciplinarian, not of the creator. He was the last of the great 18th and 19th century merchant bankers. His fundamental drive was toward order and control, and he was appalled by the storm of creative destruction at the heart of the long American boom. He detested bitter, destructive competition, eventually succeeded as no one else in imposing his iron will on the economy, reining in the competitive free-for-all, and setting rules and boundaries that held sway for half a century. So Morris is saying much more eloquently than me. That's why I quote him. The same thing I've been saying for a number of slides now. What brakeman meant. This guy's taking all sort of the rough energy, the creative stuff that the other guys did, but realizing it's messy and has to be cleaned up. And he was the guy to do it. He really was a one-man central bank. The Federal Reserve isn't created until 1913, just after Morgan was gone. And in many ways, and this is actually true. I mean, there was people that literally in the government that were literally thinking this and expressing it. That's how we know. But J.P. Morgan bailed the government out. They went to him a number of times when there were economic crises and needed his help, his advice, because again, he was known as the guy that knew the economy better than anyone else. So even the U.S. government thought that was true, and it seemed to be because he got the job done. When talking about the possibility, federal officials of a central bank, what became the Federal Reserve System, there was thinking, well, okay, Morgan is really good at this kind of stuff, fixing the economy when it goes sour, or figuring out what at least to do to fix it. But he's one guy, and he's getting older, and he's eventually going to die. What do we do then? What we're going to need is not one person that we have to rely on. We're going to need an institution that's there permanently, that basically acts sort of, he's the institutional version of J.P. Morgan. I'm not kidding. That is actually how the creators of the Federal Reserve, at least some of them, thought about this project. They had J.P. Morgan in mind. He bailed the government out on two famous occasions. 1894, I believe it was, in the middle of that depression, and 1907 during a financial crash that didn't lead to depression then. In 1894, the depression had caused many Americans to worry about the collapse of the money system, the deflation. The value of the dollar was going down, and they feared it was going to bottom out. So people wanted to cash in, and were cashing in their dollars for gold. America was on the gold standard. We'll do more on that in another unit, which meant for there was supposed to be gold, and there was, in the U.S. Treasury vaults, so that if you wanted to sort of cash out your dollar bills for gold, you could. They were supposed to give you the equivalent in gold for dollar bills. Because why would somebody care? Because most of the time, gold and silver are seen to have intrinsic value, and sort of they stay more stable in their value, in times of crisis and depression or recession, in a way that money, paper money, doesn't always do. So when people start not trusting the money, this is still true to this day, they'll often sort of invest heavily in gold, because that tends to retain its value. And so this is what's happening. Why was the U.S. on the gold standard? Again, more on that later. But here, let's just say that it helped people to, again, be more confident in the money supply, knowing it was backed by gold. Now, of course, if everybody came to the bank at one time, or a bank, demanding their $25,000 savings account, paid in gold to cash out, then they couldn't be done, because the U.S. government only had a fraction. They had a ratio. I don't know what the ratio was, that they had to they're supposed to keep the gold to actual money in the bank ratio, right? Or money in the treasury vaults in the bank. I'm sorry, money in the bank. So, but if they only have like 6%. So the amount of money that we have in circulation, we've got 6% of that in gold reserves, or 8%. That's not going to cover everybody if they all come in on one day and say, we're panicked, we want our gold, we're cashing in our dollars, give us gold. And that's sort of what was happening in 1884. So many Americans were cashing out and taking gold that the U.S. Treasury vaults started to dip and started to empty out, and they went below whatever the specified ratio was, and they could have gone. It was getting dangerously low and could have gone lower, and so the Treasury Department in the U.S. government started to freak out. President then went to Morgan and said, "What can you do?" And Morgan put together a consortium of bankers and investors, some from England. He maintained connections there from his father's bank, which did quite a business in England as well. So he had European investors, and they were able to sort of raise enough gold to put enough back into the U.S. Vaults to get them back up to their ratio to be safe. But Morgan, of course, demanded a profit out of it. He didn't go to them. They came to him, and he's the one who called the shots. They more or less said, "Hey, could you help us out?" And he kind of said, like, "Well, okay, I will if shows them an offer sheet. I will if you sign this contract and agree to pay me this much." And they said yes. And he didn't make a. I mean, he made, I don't know, it was in the, I think in the millions. But he's been criticized a lot for that. Well, if he was really a leader that cared about the health of the economy, then why would he take money for that at all? If he saw himself as the guy that's supposed to stabilize the economy, that's his responsibility, then why take money? Well, first of all, he's a banker. What he knows to do is profit. He is providing an invaluable service to the government, helping to keep them afloat. And he could have charged a lot more money, frankly. So he can be criticized for this, and some historians do. But I think he can be seen as sort of acting totally appropriately as well. So he bails the government out once. In 1907, in the financial panic, banks were crashing, going out of business, going bankrupt, and Morgan had an interest in saving the situation anyway, because his bank could have gone under too. But the government came to him again and said, can you figure out what we can do? And he had some of his sort of top economic minds in his company study the situation, and whether they were right or wrong, they boiled it down to sort of one bank. I forget the name of it, but in Manhattan, in Wall Street, where Morgan's bank was. But if we save this one bank, prop them up, I think we can sort of put a firewall up and stop the rest of them from crashing. But if we don't stop this one, we all might go down like dominoes. So Morgan invited all the big bankers to his house, and what's now the Morgan Library in Midtown Manhattan was once part of his house. His library room is incredible. That's blurry because I took that picture last time I was there. That was his house. Now it's been moved, and that's only one room of the house, but that's his library. That's his study. It's incredible. I wanted to get like the books from floor to ceiling, but I couldn't get far enough back to get sort of the whole thing, and it's missing the bottom shelves. So incredible. But that room is famous because that's where he invited the bankers in 1907, and he went around the room and told them, "Here's what we found. Such and such bank needs to be saved, and we're going to pony up the money to save it. So we have to figure out before we leave here today how much each of us, each of our banks is going to pitch in to prop this other bank up." And there, of course, was an uproar because these are bankers, capitalists, and they were used to competing against that bank. Now they're going to give it money, and so this wasn't exactly popular. But Morgan, tried to tell them, "Look, this affects us all. We could all, not only could the economy crash, but our banks could crash if we don't do this. So it's in our best interest anyway." But he was still having a tough time selling it. And apparently what he did, and this story is still told, this is a museum there now. They'll tell you this story if you go there now too. But he locked them in. For whatever reason, you could lock the doors from outside the library. He locked them in and said, "Knock. I'll be across the hall. Knock when you've figured out how much you are all in to pay, and you come to this total number, and I'll let you out." So he basically just said, "You're not leaving my house until you've agreed to and figured out how much we're going to give this other bank." And he went across the room. That room is in this museum too. And it's another little study. It's an actual small one in this case with a desk. And he apparently just sat there and played solitaire for an hour or 2 hours, whatever it was, and just calmly played solitaire. And there was a knock at the door, and they had the piece of paper and the agreement. "Okay, you guys can go now." So this is getting things done by force of personality, right? So not everybody can do that. It's not just because he had a lot of money and everybody knew he had connections with the government and they trusted him. It's partly that, but he just had like a towering force of personality. Sometimes people can get their way because they have a big personality. Sometimes it's intimidating. Sometimes it's just kind of a larger than life personality, and he seems to have sort of had that. And the crisis was averted. Overall, we can't be certain that his solution, propping up that bank, is what saved the day, but the government thought so for sure. Morgan's public image then became a positive one in time too, and the political cartoon here is hilarious, of course. Right? That's J.P. Morgan as a grown-up rowing little child Uncle Sam to safety, right, and kind of reassuring him, "Don't worry, son. I'll get you. I'll get you back to shore safely." So Morgan is the grown-up, and the U.S. government is sort of there, frightened and needing his help, which is actually true. There's sometimes, I don't know if this is true, but there's sometimes talk that the little business guy in Monopoly, which you see there, was sort of based on, loosely based on J.P. Morgan's visage. So in the end, with at least regard to these guys, what are we supposed to make of them? Cornelius Vanderbilt, another Gilded Age big-time capitalist, though he died in the 1870s. I mentioned some of his relatives in the last lecture. But he said at one point, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" And he was a notoriously uncouth guy. But what are we supposed to make of these guys? Are they robber barons, bad guys, or are they captains of industry, industrial statesmen, more noble? The noble sounding, a way of describing them. Well, there's a pro and a con, of course. You can argue that they laid the foundations for the wealth and power of the U.S. in general, not just then, but we could say up until the present, that they laid the foundations for our gigantic, wealthy, industrial economy and society to this day. Right? It's a good argument. The American way of life and standard of living, which has been high ever since, with some fluctuations, but still high by global standards, more specifically, is at least in part their doing. On the downside, you can say that they damage democratic institutions through overbearing, aggressive actions, set a precedent or series of precedents for unethical behavior in business and in society at large. And there's some other pros and cons too, but you get the point. This is an interpretive matter, and different historians see these guys different ways, and it's not clear what the absolute right answer is. I'm somewhat agnostic on this question myself.